Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. End of part 1. The next morning, Mark stood outside the Brooks Bistro, his mind still racing from the meeting he had the night before. The cold Texas wind whipped through the streets, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were consumed by the conversation with Eleanor. Was he really going to go through with it? Marry a woman he barely knew just to escape his debts? But the thought of his mother and sister, struggling with the weight of his father's debts, kept pushing him forward. He had no other choice. He had to make this work. He stepped inside the bistro, his heart pounding as he saw Eleanor sitting at the same table, her expression unreadable. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I'm glad you decided to come back," she said with a calm smile, her eyes steady on his. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from her. "I've thought about it," he said quietly, trying to steady his voice. "And I'll do it. I'll marry you." Eleanor's smile didn't waver, but there was a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. She had known he would come around. "Good," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Now, let's go over the details." She handed him a folder. Inside were legal documents, all carefully laid out, outlining the terms of their marriage. There would be no love involved. No physical intimacy. The agreement was purely business, and both would be expected to maintain their separate lives outside of the arrangement. "It's all very straightforward," Eleanor explained, her tone businesslike. "You will live in my estate, and I will cover all your debts. In return, you will be my husband in name only. The public will think of us as a couple, but that's where it ends." Mark scanned the documents, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. It seemed simple enough, but he knew it wouldn't be. "What's the catch?" he asked, looking up at her. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but her smile remained unchanged. "There's no catch, Mark. But you will be expected to attend events with me. You will represent me at social gatherings, and you will be involved in some business dealings. I need you to show up, play the part, and keep up appearances. Can you do that?" Mark felt a rush of uncertainty. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but he had no other option. His future depended on it. "Yeah," he said, his voice firming. "I can do that." "Good," Eleanor said, standing up. "The papers are ready to be signed. But before we do that, there's one more thing we need to discuss." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. Mark stared at it, confused. Eleanor opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. It was beautiful, and for a moment, he forgot about the strange circumstances that had brought them here. She held it out to him. "This will be your symbol of commitment," she said. "A reminder that this is a legal agreement, not a romantic one. Do you understand?" Mark nodded, taking the ring. It felt heavy in his hand, as if it were a constant reminder of the life he was about to step into. "I understand," he said quietly. Eleanor smiled and stood up, holding out the papers. "Then, let's make it official." Mark signed the documents, and just like that, his life changed. The weight of his father's debts, the pressure on his shoulders, was lifted. But a new weight began to settle in its place, the weight of a life he never imagined he would be living. As he left the bistro, ring in hand, he couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. Was this really the solution? Or was he just trading one set of problems for another? The answer, he realized, would only come with time. The days following the signing of the agreement passed in a blur. Mark settled into his new life at Eleanor's mansion, an imposing structure with towering columns and perfectly manicured gardens. He was still getting used to the opulence around him, the luxury he had never known, and the strange, silent role he had to play in this carefully constructed facade. It was surreal. Every morning, a butler would bring him breakfast in bed, and a private driver would take him wherever he needed to go. He was living a life he had never dreamed of, but it felt hollow. He wasn't a husband in the traditional sense of was a paid companion, a placeholder. The first few weeks were difficult. He attended galas with Eleanor, always by her side, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with influential people, and playing the part of a devoted husband. But there was no love, no real connection. Just endless social events and carefully curated appearances. Eleanor kept her distance, her demeanor polite but businesslike. She was cold, reserved, and there was always an invisible wall between them, as if they were both just going through the motions. But despite the formality of their arrangement, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was keeping something from him. It was in the way she would look at him sometimes, her eyes unreadable, or the moments when she would briefly let her guard down, showing a flicker of vulnerability before quickly masking it again. It was as if she was living in a world of her own, where emotions were something to be avoided. One evening, after another gala, Mark found himself sitting alone in the living room of the mansion, the faint hum of the city below mingling with the silence of the house. He was tired, physically and emotionally. He had played his role for so long, but it was starting to wear on him. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. He had traded his freedom for security, but was it worth it? Was this the life he truly wanted? Just as he was about to stand up, Eleanor entered the room. She was dressed in a sleek black gown, her hair perfectly styled, but there was something different about her tonight. She wasn't wearing her usual mask of indifference. She looked vulnerable. She paused when she saw him, her eyes softening for the briefest of moments. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right?" He blinked, surprised by the question. Eleanor never asked about his well-being, not really. She was always about business, always keeping things impersonal. He wasn't sure what to say. "I'm fine," he replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "Just tired." She nodded, then walked over to the bar and poured herself a glass of wine. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until she finally spoke again. "I know this isn't easy for you," she said, her tone more serious now. "But we both have our reasons for doing this. It's not just about the money, you know. It's about security, about making sure we don't lose everything we've worked for." Mark looked at her, studying her face for any sign of the emotion she always kept buried. He saw nothing but a calm, collected exterior. But something in her words struck a chord with him. She wasn't just protecting her wealth. She was protecting herself, too. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Eleanor wasn't just some cold, calculating businesswoman. She had her own fears, her own insecurities. They were just buried beneath layers of armor, hidden behind a facade of control. He felt a sudden wave of sympathy for her. They were both trapped in this arrangement, both pretending to be something they weren't. "I get it," he said softly. "But don't you ever wonder what it would be like if we were just two people? Without all the rules and the appearances?" Eleanor turned to him then, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, there was a flicker of something there, something raw and real. But it was gone almost as quickly as it came. She took a deep breath, then walked over and stood in front of him. "I can't do that," she said, her voice low. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, Mark. I can't just throw it all away." There was a finality to her words, but something in her eyes told him that she was more conflicted than she let on. Mark stared at her, wondering if there was more to her than what she showed the world. Could they ever truly connect? Or would they both remain strangers, bound together by a contract that neither of them had chosen? The days turned into weeks, and the distance between Mark and Eleanor seemed to grow rather than shrink. Despite their late-night conversations, despite the rare moments when Eleanor would let down her guard, there was still something impenetrable about her. Mark was beginning to realize just how deeply embedded her walls were. He was a husband in name only, and she had made it clear that nothing more would come of their arrangement. Still, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her. One night, as he sat alone in the library of the mansion, a book open in front of him but his mind miles away, he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. It was Eleanor. She was dressed in a simple robe, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She looked different. Her usual sharp, polished appearance had been replaced with something more relaxed, almost vulnerable. Mark looked up from his book, surprised to see her at this hour. "Eleanor?" he asked, his voice low. She paused, her eyes flicking to the book in his hands before meeting his gaze. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. He nodded, setting the book aside. "Of course." She walked over and sat down beside him, her movements slow and deliberate. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint crackling of the fireplace. Then, Eleanor spoke. "Mark," she began, her voice softer than usual. "I know I've been distant. It's just that, this isn't easy for me." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard her sound this way, vulnerable, unsure. "I get it," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to change overnight." She looked at him, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite place. "It's not just about this marriage. It's everything. I've spent my entire life building this empire. I've made sacrifices, pushed people away. I've been alone. And now, I've found myself trapped in this contract, this life that's been forced on me. But it's not just about me. It's about the legacy I'm trying to protect. The future of my family, my name." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't let go of that. Not yet." Mark stared at her, his mind racing. He could understand her need to protect what she had built. But something in her eyes told him that there was more to it. She wasn't just protecting her empire, she was protecting herself from something deeper, something she had buried for years. "I didn't ask for any of this either," Mark said softly, his voice laced with frustration. "I didn't ask to be part of your business deal. But I did it. I agreed to your terms. And now I'm starting to wonder if it was the right choice." Eleanor's eyes flashed, but she quickly masked her emotions, turning away from him. "You think I have a choice in all of this?" she snapped, her voice suddenly cold. "I didn't ask for any of this either. But we're both stuck now." The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unspoken words. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but he stopped himself. What was he supposed to say? What was the point of continuing this conversation when it felt like neither of them was willing to truly open up? After a long silence, Eleanor stood up abruptly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice back to its usual controlled tone. "I shouldn't have come to you like this." She turned to leave, but Mark couldn't just let her go. He stood up quickly, catching her arm before she could exit the room. "Eleanor," he said, his voice more firm this time. "We don't have to do this alone. You're not alone in this. We've both made sacrifices. But we can't keep pretending that this is just a contract. It's real, Eleanor. And it's not just about the empire or the future, it's about us." She turned to face him, her eyes softening, but the walls were still there, strong and unyielding. She pulled her arm gently from his grasp and shook her head. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't. You're not in my shoes. I can't let myself care. Not like this. I can't let myself feel." Mark felt a pang of sympathy for her, but also frustration. He had tried so hard to break through to her, but each time, it felt like he was met with an impenetrable barrier. "I don't expect you to change overnight," he said softly. "But maybe we can find a way to make this work. Together." Eleanor didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mark standing there, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Could he ever truly reach her? Or would their marriage always be a business transaction? Only time would tell. The days after their conversation were tense. Mark could feel the distance between him and Eleanor growing wider, like a chasm neither of them was willing to cross. The walls she had built around herself were as high as ever, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break through. He couldn't get through to her. Yet, something about the way she looked at him so fleeting, so guarded kept him up at night, wondering if there was more to her than the cold, unfeeling businesswoman she projected. Then came the day when everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon, and Mark had just returned from an early meeting with one of Eleanor's business partners. He walked into the mansion, expecting the usual silence. But today was different. He heard voices coming from the library. It was Eleanor, but this time, she wasn't alone. Mark hesitated at the door, peering inside. Eleanor was sitting on the couch, her back stiff, as a man stood beside her, gesturing passionately with his hands. Mark couldn't make out their words, but there was an intensity in the air. The man was older, his clothes pressed, his tone authoritative. As Mark watched, the man leaned in, his voice lowering. "Eleanor," he said, "you can't keep doing this. You need to decide what comes first, your empire or your family." Eleanor's face remained neutral, but Mark saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes. She didn't respond immediately. She just stared at the man, her lips pressed tightly together. The tension between them was palpable. The man spoke again, softer now, his voice almost pleading. "You've built an empire, Eleanor. But what good is it if you're alone at the top?" Eleanor looked away, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond, but Mark could see the conflict in her. The man sighed heavily and stood up, walking toward the door. "I'll leave you to think about it," he said, his voice resigned. "But you can't ignore this forever." As the door clicked shut, Eleanor remained sitting, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her lap. Mark stood there, his heart racing. He wanted to approach her, to comfort her, but something told him she wasn't ready for that yet. He waited until he heard her footsteps approaching. She walked past him without a word, but then, unexpectedly, she stopped. "Mark," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. He turned to face her. She was no longer the cold, calculating woman he had come to know. There was something different in her eyes, something vulnerable. "I never wanted this," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I never wanted to be trapped in this world. But it's all I know. It's all I've ever known." Mark stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You don't have to be alone, Eleanor," he said. "You don't have to do this by yourself. We can face this together." She shook her head, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "I don't know if I can do that. I've spent so many years protecting myself, protecting my empire. Letting someone in, it's not that simple." Mark reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but he didn't touch her. He knew she needed space. "It's not simple," he said quietly, "but sometimes the hardest things are the ones worth fighting for." Eleanor looked up at him then, her eyes filled with emotion. For the first time in weeks, she didn't look like the distant, untouchable woman he had been living with. She looked human. She looked lost. "I'm scared, Mark," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what happens if I let go. What happens if I lose everything I've worked for?" Mark's heart ached for her, but he knew what he had to say. "You don't have to lose everything, Eleanor. You just have to let yourself feel something. Let yourself care." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it was also filled with a quiet understanding. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice stronger now. Maybe you're right," she said, her eyes searching his. "Maybe I've been pushing everyone away because I'm scared of what I might lose. But I don't want to be alone anymore." Mark stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You don't have to be alone. Not anymore." Eleanor looked up at him, her expression softening. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean into him, just for a moment. And in that moment, Mark knew that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work not just as a business arrangement, but as something real. The next few days were filled with a new, tentative energy between Mark and Eleanor. They began to break down the walls they had built around each other, slowly learning to communicate beyond the boundaries of their contract. Eleanor started to show him glimpses of the woman behind the empire, the woman who had dreams, fears, and a past she kept hidden from the world. Mark, too, began to reveal parts of himself he had long buried. They shared quiet moments, small gestures, that slowly began to build a bridge between them. But as much as they tried to connect, there was still a lingering tension. Eleanor had agreed to give their arrangement a chance, but she couldn't shake the constant fear that letting someone in might mean losing control. One evening, they were both invited to a charity gala, an event that Eleanor had been planning for months. The air in the mansion was buzzing with preparation. Mark was standing in front of the full-length mirror in his room, adjusting his cufflinks when Eleanor walked in. She looked stunning, her dress a sleek, black number that seemed to shimmer under the light. Her hair was elegantly styled, and her makeup was impeccable. But there was something about her expression that felt distant, as if she was already preparing for the role she had to play. "You look beautiful," Mark said, unable to hide the admiration in his voice. Eleanor glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied softly, though the weight of her thoughts seemed to be pulling her away from the moment. Mark noticed the shift in her mood and stepped closer. "Eleanor," he said gently, "we don't have to do this tonight if you're not ready." She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. There was something vulnerable in her gaze, something he hadn't seen before. "I have to do this, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about the event. It's about proving that I'm still in control. That I can handle everything, no matter what." He could feel the tension in her words, the weight she carried on her shoulders. Mark stepped forward, taking her hand gently. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." Eleanor's eyes softened, but her walls were still up, not fully ready to let go. She smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered, "but tonight I need to do this for myself." Mark nodded, understanding her need for independence, but it still hurt to see her retreat into herself when they were so close. He had hoped that the connection they had been building would continue to grow, but it seemed that Eleanor wasn't ready to take that final step. As they arrived at the gala, the atmosphere was glamorous, with guests mingling, laughter echoing through the grand hall, and the soft clink of glasses filling the air. Mark followed Eleanor through the crowd, their presence commanding attention. He could see how Eleanor slid effortlessly into her role, charming, poised, and perfectly in control. Yet, despite her outward composure, Mark could sense her anxiety. As the night wore on, Eleanor seemed more distant, engaging in conversations with guests but never allowing herself to truly relax. Mark could feel her withdrawing, the walls she had carefully built creeping back into place. Finally, toward the end of the evening, Eleanor excused herself from a conversation with a fellow philanthropist. She walked to the edge of the balcony, her gaze lost in the city lights below. Mark watched her from a distance, then approached quietly, standing beside her. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor turned her head toward him, her eyes weary. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tired. "This." "Pretending everything's fine," Mark said, taking a step closer. "You don't have to pretend with me." For the first time that night, Eleanor's facade cracked. She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. "I'm so tired, Mark," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I'm tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Tired of carrying this burden alone. But I don't know how to stop." Mark reached out, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm here. Let me help you." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. For a moment, there was a flicker of something real, something human in her gaze. She bit her lip, then looked away, the weight of her responsibilities pulling her back. I don't know how to let go, Mark, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. I've spent my whole life building this empire, protecting it. I don't know what it would mean to just let go. Mark stepped closer, his hand gently resting on hers. You don't have to let go of everything, Eleanor. Just let yourself be free. For once. She didn't respond, but Mark could feel the change in her. There was a shift in the air, something between them that hadn't been there before. He didn't know where their journey would take them, but he was willing to help her find the way. Together. The next morning, Eleanor woke up to the soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. Mark's words from last night echoed in her mind, and as much as she tried to push them away, they lingered. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe that was okay. As she walked into the kitchen, Mark was already there, sitting at the island with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, offering a quiet smile. Morning, he said, his voice calm, but warm. Morning, she replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The tension that had once filled the space between them was gone, replaced by a new sense of ease. They didn't need to speak much, just the simple act of sharing the morning together felt like progress. As she took a seat beside him, she realized how much she had changed in the past few days. She had started to let go of the armor she had worn for years, little by little, and the world didn't feel so heavy anymore. She could breathe again. But just as the moment felt comfortable, her phone buzzed. Eleanor glanced at the screen and saw the name of her lawyer flashing across it. Her stomach sank. Mark noticed the change in her expression and raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? He asked. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, just work. I'll take care of it later. She didn't want to admit it to him, but she knew that there were still things she had to handle, things that couldn't be avoided. Her empire was still hers to manage, and despite everything, it was a responsibility she couldn't run from. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely consumed by it. She had Mark. He had become a part of her life, not just as her contractually obligated husband, but as someone she could trust. Someone she could lean on. After breakfast, they made their way to the office, where the day's meetings awaited. As they entered the boardroom, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of the role she had to play, the poised, confident CEO who made all the decisions. She was used to it, and she wore it like a mask. But this time, there was something different. As the meeting began, she caught Mark's eye from across the table. He smiled at her, the gesture simple but reassuring. It was as though he was silently telling her, "You're not alone in this." And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor allowed herself to smile back. The meeting went smoothly, and by the time it was over, Eleanor felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. As they left the office, she turned to Mark, her voice softer than usual. "Thank you," she said quietly. He glanced at her, confusion flickering across his face. "For what?" he asked. "For being here," she replied, her gaze steady. "For being a part of this, for showing me that there's more to life than just the empire." Mark nodded, his expression sincere. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor." He paused, his tone thoughtful. "But just so you know, this thing between us? It's not just about the contract anymore. I'm in this for you." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing words like that. Not from anyone, and certainly not from someone who had started out as a stranger. "I'm in this for you, too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. They had crossed a line, no longer just two people stuck in an arrangement but something more. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to build something real together. As they stepped into the car and drove away from the office, Eleanor looked out the window, her thoughts drifting. The world still had its challenges, her responsibilities still loomed large, but she no longer felt like she was carrying it all alone. Mark was by her side, and that made all the difference. The weeks passed, and a quiet shift began to take place in Eleanor and Mark's relationship. What had started as a cold, calculated arrangement was slowly morphing into something neither of them had expected. They had begun to open up to each other in ways neither of them had thought possible. Eleanor was no longer the distant, untouchable CEO, and Mark was no longer just the man fulfilling a contract. They had become partners, in every sense of the word. But there were still moments when the weight of their pasts would resurface, moments when the reality of their arrangement threatened to pull them apart. It happened one evening, as they sat in the living room of the mansion. Eleanor was on the couch, going through papers from one of her business ventures, while Mark sat across from her, his attention split between a book and the soft music playing in the background. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by the sound of Eleanor's phone ringing. She glanced at the screen, her expression immediately hardening. Mark watched as she answered the call, her tone shifting from calm to businesslike in an instant. "Eleanor Brooks," she said, her voice firm. There was a pause as she listened, and then she replied, "I understand. I'll be there tomorrow." She ended the call quickly, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. Mark could sense the change in her. The mask was back on, the walls starting to rise again. He set his book down and leaned forward, studying her. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. Eleanor didn't immediately answer. She kept her gaze fixed on the papers, avoiding his eyes. "Just work," she said curtly. But Mark knew better. He could see the strain in her posture, the way her jaw clenched as she processed whatever news she had just received. He stood up and walked over to her, gently taking the papers from her hands. "Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "What's going on?" She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just a business issue. I'll handle it." But Mark wasn't convinced. He could tell something was off. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm here, Eleanor. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." She stared at him for a long moment, the conflict clear in her eyes. Finally, she sighed, letting her shoulders slump in defeat. "It's about the company," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a deal I've been working on for months, and it's falling apart. If this doesn't go through, everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it could all come crashing down." Mark sat down beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Eleanor, you've been carrying all of this by yourself for so long. You don't have to do it alone anymore," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "I don't know how to let go," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life fighting for control. I'm scared of losing it." Mark gave her a reassuring smile, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder. "You don't have to control everything. It's okay to lean on someone else. It's okay to let go sometimes." Eleanor swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to surface. She had spent so long building her empire, protecting it, and the thought of losing it all was terrifying. But sitting next to Mark, with his steady presence and calm reassurance, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. For the first time in a long time, she realized that maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. Maybe there was a chance for her to build something not just with her business, but with someone who truly cared. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. Mark smiled and pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her tightly as if to remind her that she wasn't alone anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered back, his words a promise. "We'll get through this together." And in that moment, Eleanor realized that she had finally found something worth holding on to, someone who could stand beside her, not just for her empire, but for her heart as well. The weeks that followed were a turning point for both Eleanor and Mark. They began to build something deeper, something real, despite the challenges that still lay ahead. Eleanor's business was on the brink of collapse, but with Mark by her side, she felt a new sense of resolve. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean on someone, and it made all the difference. Mark, too, had changed. The man who had entered into this marriage as a means to escape his financial troubles had found something he never expected: a woman who had become more than just a contract, more than just a business arrangement. She had become his partner, not just in name, but in life. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their home, overlooking the city below, Eleanor turned to Mark. There was a softness in her gaze, a warmth that had been absent when they first met. "Mark," she said quietly, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You've been my strength when I couldn't find my own." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You've been my strength too," he replied, his voice sincere. "I never thought I would find someone like you. Someone who could understand me, who could see me for who I really am." Eleanor smiled, the weight of everything they had been through together reflected in her eyes. "I used to think I needed to do everything on my own," she said softly. "That I had to carry the weight of the world by myself. But now, I realize that it's okay to let someone in. It's okay to share the load." Mark nodded, his thumb lightly brushing over her hand. "We're a team, Eleanor," he said. "And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Just then, a car pulled up in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Eleanor turned her head, her expression shifting back to that of the confident CEO she had always been. The meeting she had been dreading was about to take place. Mark could see the familiar tension returning to her shoulders. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "I'll be fine," she said, straightening up. "This is part of the job. But I'll be all right with you by my side." Mark squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this." As they walked inside together, Eleanor's confidence was apparent, but it was different this time. It wasn't the same armor she had worn before, the mask she had used to protect herself. It was real. It was her. And for the first time, she allowed herself to embrace the idea that she didn't have to face everything alone. As the meeting began, Eleanor stood tall, her focus unwavering. But when she glanced over at Mark, sitting across the room, a quiet smile tugged at her lips. She knew that no matter how difficult things got, she wasn't alone anymore. They had built something real. They had found a way to turn a business arrangement into a partnership. And no matter what challenges they would face in the future, Eleanor knew they could overcome them together. The night ended with a quiet victory, the kind that only comes from facing your fears and finding strength in the people you least expect. As Eleanor and Mark walked out of the meeting room, the weight of the past seemed lighter, as if the future was something they could finally face with hope. And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to truly believe in a future, one that was filled with not just success, but love, trust, and partnership. Mark, standing by her side, was no longer just her husband in name. He was her partner, in every sense of the word. And together, they would build a life that was more than just business. It would be real, it would be theirs, and it would be enough.